The ferry, a rust-streaked hulk named the Gray Lady, bucked against the relentless chop, churning the slate-colored water into a froth that tasted of salt and something ancient, something cold. Dean gripped the railing, knuckles white, the spray a stinging slap against his face. It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep into the bones, not just from the wind, but from the desolate expanse stretching out before him. For months, the world had been a muffled, indistinct blur, his grief a heavy cloak. This island, this remote, forgotten speck on the map, was meant to be his blank slate, a place where the relentless echoes of what he'd lost might finally recede. The journey had begun with a cramped drive to a distant port, followed by a perfunctory stop at a small, weather-beaten shack designated as the border checkpoint. A gruff official, his face a roadmap of sun-creased wrinkles, had barely glanced at Dean's papers. His gaze instead fixed on the distant, fog-shrouded horizon. He'd simply grunted, "Another one?" and waved Dean through, a dismissive gesture that had felt less like an invitation and more like a warning. Now the island loomed, a jagged silhouette against a sky bruised purple and gray. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of brine and decaying kelp, overlaid with a faint metallic tang Dean couldn't quite place. He imagined the island breathing, a slow, deep inhalation before an even slower exhalation. He was a cartographer, accustomed to precision, to lines and angles and the comforting certainty of a grid. But this place defied geometry. It felt untamed, its edges blurring into the perpetual mist. The lighthouse, his destination, stood sentinel on the highest bluff, a stark, cylindrical finger pointing skyward. When the ferry finally scraped against the barnacled dock, the sound was a jarring protest. A solitary figure, the ferryman, helped him unload his sparse belongings. A trunk of clothes, a box of old maps, his surveying equipment. The ferryman didn't speak, merely nodded, his eyes as gray and watchful as the sea. Dean felt a peculiar weight settle upon him. A sense of being observed not just by the man, but by the very stones of the island. The path to the cottage was a treacherous ascent, a winding ribbon of loose gravel and exposed roots. He could hear the ocean's ceaseless roar, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth. The lighthouse keeper's cottage appeared suddenly, nestled just below the lighthouse itself. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a squat stone structure, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent sea. Decay had taken hold with a vengeance. Paint peeled in leprous flakes from the window frames, and the slate roof sagged in places, a patchwork of missing tiles. A rusted weather vane, shaped like a fish, pointed stubbornly east despite the gusting westerly wind. He pushed open the heavy oak door. It groaned in protest, a sound like an old man clearing his throat, and the interior greeted him with a blast of stale air, thick with the smell of damp stone, salt, and something else. Something faintly organic, like dried seaweed or forgotten dust. Moonlight, diffused by the fog, filtered through the grimy windows, painting the rough-hewn floorboards in muted silver and gray. Dust motes danced in the sparse light, swirling like miniature constellations. The cottage was sparsely furnished, as if his grandfather had left in a hurry, or perhaps had never truly settled. A sturdy wooden table stood in the center of the main room, scarred by years of use. A single rickety chair was overturned beside it. He could almost feel the phantom weight of his grandfather's hand, the quiet solitude of a life spent charting the predictable rhythms of the sea, and perhaps the unpredictable rhythms of something else entirely. In the corner of the main room, a large antique barometer hung crookedly on the wall, its needle frozen at stormy. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that dissolved quickly into the heavy air. As he ventured into a small, adjoining chamber, perhaps a study or a sleeping alcove, a faint, rhythmic thump, thump. It was too regular to be the wind, too deep to be the creaking of the old house. He stopped, holding his breath, listening intently. The sound was subtle, barely perceptible, like a slow, distant heartbeat. He strained his ears, but it ceased as quickly as it had begun, leaving only the relentless sigh of the wind and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Dean dismissed it as the house settling, or perhaps the effect of his own exhaustion and grief-addled mind. He was here for solitude, for quiet. Yet, as he stood in the decaying room, an undeniable prickle of unease crawled up his spine. It was the kind of journey that scoured the soul clean, or left it even more exposed. The island, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky, grew larger with each shuddering lurch of the vessel. A single, unwavering light pulsed from its highest point. The lighthouse, his grandfather's former domain, now his. Disembarking felt like stepping onto another planet. The air was thicker here, heavy with brine and the damp earth of the moorland. A lone dockhand, a man whose face seemed carved from the weather-beaten wood of the pier, tossed Dean's duffel bag onto the gravel. Dean retrieved the heavy wooden crate containing his cartography tools, the weight of familiar comfort. He glanced towards a small, corrugated iron shack leaning precariously near the ferry ramp, a faded sign above its door declaring it the border checkpoint. A port official, stout and silent, merely watched him with eyes the color of the churning sea. Offering no greeting, no instruction, just an unnerving, steady gaze that seemed to catalog every detail of Dean's presence. He pushed past the feeling, attributing it to the isolation and his own frayed nerves. The cottage stood stark and uninviting, perched on a rise overlooking the churning expanse of the ocean. It was smaller than he remembered from the old photographs, its whitewash peeling like sunburnt skin, the windows blind with salt spray. He dropped his bags in the main room, the thud echoing in the oppressive silence. He was alone, truly alone. The first night passed in a fitful haze of half-sleep and jarring wakefulness. The wind howled a ceaseless lament around the eaves, rattling the window panes as if impatient hands sought entry. He rose before dawn, drawn by an inexplicable urge to see the tide. He'd always found solace in the predictable rhythm of the sea, the rise and fall a cosmic clock. But something was wrong. The tide was too high, surging further up the rocky shore than he remembered from his childhood visits, frothing against the very foundations of the cottage's seawall. It receded with an unnatural slowness, then rushed back in with a sudden, violent swell, almost as if breathing. He watched, mesmerized and increasingly unnerved, as the water clawed at the land, not with the gentle lapping of waves, but with a hungry, relentless pull. He tried to rationalize it. A storm surge, an unusual spring tide, the island's unique topography. Later, while attempting to unpack the few boxes he'd brought, he started to hear them. Faint at first, carried on the ceaseless wind, they seemed to coil around the cottage, slipping through cracks in the old stone. They were indistinct, like voices speaking just beyond the threshold of hearing, a murmur of forgotten languages or the sibilant hiss of the retreating tide. He paused, listening intently, but the moment he focused, they would dissipate, leaving only the shriek of the gulls and the roar of the waves. Dean shook his head, pressing his palms against his temples. Grief, he told himself. Solitude. The mind played tricks. He found it tucked beneath a loose floorboard in his grandfather's old study, hidden beneath a stack of brittle nautical charts. He handled it with care, the faint, briny smell of the sea clinging to its very fibers. The handwriting inside was his grandfather's, familiar yet shaky, almost frantic in places. The early entries were mundane, logs of weather patterns and lighthouse maintenance. But as he turned the fragile pages, the script grew more erratic, the observations more unsettling. Interspersed with these were cryptic warnings, scrawled in thick black ink that bled through the paper. The deep song calls. It wakes. The pact forgotten, but never broken. Do not listen. Do not look into the deep. Dean's breath hitched. He traced a finger over a particularly unsettling drawing. A swirling vortex with tiny, almost imperceptible figures being drawn into its maw. The words, "The Deep Song," appeared again and again, sometimes underlined, sometimes circled, almost an obsession. His grandfather, a man of quiet stoicism, had never spoken of such things. Had the isolation, the relentless vigil, finally broken him? Dean tried to tell himself it was the ramblings of an old man, perhaps a touch of senility, exacerbated by the relentless solitude of the island. This was fantasy, delusion. And through the grimy window, he saw it. This was not grief, not solitude. This was something else entirely. Dean's breath hitched, the ghost of his fingertip still lingering on the journal's page. The vortex, the tiny figures, the insistent scrawl of the deep song. His grandfather's obsession had become a cold, unwelcome hand on Dean's shoulder. This wasn't just a collection of paranoid ramblings. The sheer volume, the meticulous detail, the raw fear bleeding from every line suggested something far more insidious. He needed context, something to anchor these wild sketches to reality, or to dismiss them entirely. The island offered little in the way of conventional research. No local library, no historical society. His cottage had a weak, unreliable internet connection, a grudging concession to the modern world that flickered like a dying ember. He spent the next day hunched over his laptop, the dim screen casting a pale glow on his face, sifting through archived regional newspapers, obscure maritime forums, and digitized local histories. Most entries were mundane: fishing yields, weather patterns, a handful of shipwrecks. But then, a flicker. Tales of a sunken city, not a literal metropolis, but a scattering of ancient, oddly shaped stones submerged offshore, visible only at extreme low tide or through the clearest waters. It spoke of ancient rites performed by the earliest inhabitants, rituals to appease the deep, lest its hunger stir. The text was vague, almost dismissive, framing it as quaint folklore. His grandfather's journal, with its swirling motifs and cryptic references to the Leviathan and the Silent Pact, began to resonate with an unsettling clarity. He returned to the journal, its worn leather cover feeling heavier in his hands. The scrawled entries, once maddeningly opaque, now offered fragmented glimpses of a terrifying narrative. "The offering must be made," one line read, underscored violently. "The pact is broken." The determination in Dean solidified, tempered by a growing unease. He needed to speak to someone who knew the island's true history, someone who might remember these legends not as folklore, but as a warning. The nearest town with a proper archive was on the mainland, a journey requiring a ferry and passing through the island's single desolate border checkpoint. The structure was a squat concrete box, weathered by salt spray and time, manned by a single grizzled attendant whose uniform seemed several sizes too large. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of sea air and the faint, sickly sweet scent of decay that always seemed to cling to the island. Dean pulled his vehicle up, the gravel crunching under the tires. The attendant, a broad-shouldered woman with eyes like polished stones, merely grunted, scanning his identification card without a word. His gaze, however, lingered on Dean for a moment too long, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths before he waved him through. It was a fleeting interaction, yet it left Dean feeling scrutinized, as if he knew something about his grandfather or about the cottage that he wasn't saying. He drove to the mainland, the ferry ride a blur of gray sea and low-hanging mist. The mainland library, a small, dusty building with shelves groaning under the weight of forgotten tomes, offered more concrete details. He found mention of the island's early settlers, a small, reclusive community with unusual spiritual practices, their ceremonies often involving the sea. One brittle yellow document, a local historian's amateur treatise, described their belief in a deep watcher and the deep song it used to call its followers. Dean's stomach clenched. The exact phrase, right there in print. The historian had dismissed it as a pre-Christian nature worship, a vestige of paganism. But Dean knew better. His grandfather had felt its stirrings. That night, back in the cottage, the research weighing heavily on his mind, Dean's sleep was not restorative. He drifted into a restless slumber, the air thick with the smell of brine. The dreams came unbidden, vivid and disorienting. He was submerged, not drowning, but breathing water, the pressure immense, crushing. Around him, colossal shapes moved in the inky blackness, their forms indistinct, yet overwhelmingly vast. He heard it then, the deep song. Not a melody, but a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated through his bones, a sound that was both ancient and utterly alien. It was a siren call, a promise of oblivion, pulling at him with an irresistible force. He felt himself being drawn downwards, the light from above receding into a distant, mocking star. He jolted awake, gasping, the phantom pressure still squeezing his chest. The lingering sound of the thrumming echoed in his ears, a phantom sensation. He swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet meeting the cold stone floor. A strange metallic tang filled the air, replacing the usual briny scent. He stumbled toward the small, cramped kitchen, needing a glass of water to wash away the lingering taste of the dream. As his eyes adjusted, he froze. It pulsed with a soft, ethereal luminescence, a delicate, almost otherworldly blue-green light. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't mold, nor any algae he'd ever seen. It felt cool and slick to the touch, almost gelatinous. He saw it too, a smaller patch on the grout between the flagstones near the fireplace, and another barely perceptible along the sill of the bedroom window. It was everywhere, a creeping bloom of light, growing in the heart of his isolated cottage, a silent, terrible testament to the deep song that now echoed not just in his dreams, but in the very fabric of his unsettling reality. The journal lay open, its pages crinkled beneath Dean's trembling fingers. The deep song. The phrase echoed in his mind, a discordant melody he couldn't quite place. Yet it resonated with an ancient, chilling hum that seemed to vibrate just beneath his skin. His grandfather's frantic scrawl, the crudely drawn vortex, the tiny figures plummeting into an abyss, it all painted a picture of a mind unraveling, or perhaps a mind witnessing something truly horrific. He felt a peculiar blend of revulsion and an undeniable pull, a perverse curiosity to understand what had consumed his ancestor. He pushed the journal away, its secrets too heavy for the immediate moment. It was low, like the distant thrum of an engine, yet it lacked any mechanical regularity. Dean frowned, listening intently. The wind outside was a constant moan, the waves a rhythmic crash against the shore. But this was different. This was inside. He stood, walking to the small, grimy window overlooking the churning gray sea. The hum intensified slightly, a subtle vibration under his bare feet on the cold floorboards. As he watched, the mug shifted, a fraction of an inch, scraping faintly against the painted wood. His eyes narrowed. He was tired, yes, and his nerves were frayed, but he wasn't hallucinating. He reached out, touching the mug. It was still, solid. He pulled his hand back, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. The hum was a steady, low thrum now, a bass note beneath the island's natural symphony. Then, a subtle distortion. It was fleeting, a ripple in the glass that wasn't there when he touched it, but it was enough. His heart gave a hard, painful lurch against his ribs. He turned away, shaking his head, trying to dismiss it as an optical illusion, a trick of the failing light. But the image lingered, a grotesque caricature of himself. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, an invisible pressure that pressed in from all sides. He needed answers, needed to understand his grandfather's desperate warnings. He returned to the journal, flipping through pages, searching for anything beyond the vortex. He found it, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the small, dusty study. A small wooden box, crudely carved, sealed shut with what looked like dried tar. The hum grew louder, a palpable throb that seemed to resonate in the very bones of the cottage. Dean pried the box open with a rusty letter opener. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, brittle seaweed, were several items. A small, leaden fishing weight carved with an unfamiliar symbol, a bundle of human hair tied with a thin black cord, and a small, shriveled piece of what looked like a dried organ. His stomach churned. This wasn't just warding off a bad dream. This was an act of desperate appeasement, perhaps even sacrifice. The symbols on the weight mirrored some of the crude drawings in the journal, glyphs that seemed to writhe and coil, like something pulled from the deepest parts of the ocean. His grandfather hadn't just been studying an entity, he had been interacting with it, trying to keep it at bay, or perhaps keep it fed. A wave of nausea washed over Dean. He remembered a time, years ago, when he'd been crossing a remote land border, the official at the border checkpoint scrutinizing his passport, a mundane, logical process. The world had been a place of rules then, of verifiable facts. Now he was surrounded by something ancient and unknowable, something that defied every law of nature he understood. The contrast was stark, terrifying. How could he ever explain this to anyone? The hum intensified, no longer just a sound, but a force. It pressed against his eardrums, vibrated through his teeth. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of salt and decay, like a tide pool left to fester in the sun. From that corner, a form began to coalesce. It wasn't solid, not truly. Dean stumbled back, knocking over his chair with a clatter that was swallowed by the entity's growing presence. He scrambled, his legs tangled, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He could feel its proximity, a pressure in his chest, a desperate urge to gasp for air that wouldn't come. It was closer, close enough for him to feel the icy, briny breath of it on his face. He squeezed his eyes shut, a choked cry catching in his throat, bracing for an impact that never came. When he dared to open them again, the corner was empty. Only a faint, glistening dampness on the wooden floor marked where it had been. Dean stood there, trembling, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the desk to steady himself. He had seen it. He had felt it. The entity wasn't just a threat. It was here, in the cottage, a palpable, terrifying presence that had just brushed against his reality. And it wanted something. His grandfather's frantic scrawl, the ink often smudged as if written in haste or distress, continued to unravel a narrative far more intricate and terrifying than Dean had anticipated. He turned another page, the paper rustling like dry leaves. His gaze snagged on a series of dates, followed by lists of obscure components: dried kelp, ground bone, specific types of deep-sea minerals, and then a chilling notation: a measure of blood, freely given. A cold knot tightened in Dean's stomach. His grandfather hadn't merely been observing the island's strange phenomena. He had been involved. The entries shifted from detached scientific observations to desperate ritualistic preparations. He detailed precise timings, lunar cycles, and the specific incantations, or rather, utterances, needed to perform what he vaguely referred to as the binding. Dean's breath hitched. His grandfather hadn't just chronicled the entity. He had actively worked to keep it dormant, an unwilling custodian of a terrible pact. A low thrum began to manifest, not just in his mind, but seeming to emanate from the very floorboards beneath his feet. It was subtle at first, a deep, resonant vibration, like a distant, colossal bell tolling underwater. He pressed his palms to his temples, a pressure building behind his eyes. The words on the page seemed to swim, their black ink blurring into indistinct shapes. He blinked, hard, trying to clear his vision, but the lines of text continued to waver, as if seen through rising heat haze. The thrum intensified, escalating into a pervasive drone that filled his skull. It wasn't just sound, it was a physical sensation, a deep-seated ache that radiated from his inner ear. Dean shook his head, a desperate attempt to dislodge the insidious auditory assault. His eyes snapped open. The room shimmered, the familiar wooden beams of the ceiling seeming to stretch and contract. For a fleeting, horrifying moment, the cottage vanished, replaced by a stark, grimy hallway. The air was stale, tinged with the metallic tang of anxiety and disinfectant. A dull, rhythmic thudding pulsed from behind a reinforced door. He remembered this place, a border checkpoint from years ago, a nerve-wracking passage into an unfamiliar country after a particularly grueling journey. The official's gaze felt like a physical weight, digging into his very soul, searching for something hidden, something illicit. The thudding grew louder, a deep, resonant thump, 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 echoing the thrumming in his own head. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the vision fractured, dissolving like mist. He was back in the cottage, the journal still clutched in his hand, his knuckles white. He was being watched, scrutinized, judged by something far older and more profound. The deep song was not just a sound. It was a contagion, slowly dissolving the boundaries of his perception. Driven by a sudden, frantic urgency, Dean scanned the remaining entries. He pushed himself to his feet, the drone in his ears making the very act feel like a struggle against an invisible current. He moved to the base of the lighthouse, his gaze sweeping over the rough-hewn stone blocks, searching for any anomaly. He remembered his grandfather's obsession with the lighthouse's foundation, how he would often descend into the cramped, unused spaces beneath the structure, claiming to check for structural integrity. Now Dean understood. His fingers brushed against a section of stone that felt different, slightly recessed, the mortar around it almost too perfect. He pressed, pushed, ran his hand along the edges. There, a faint line, barely discernible, where one large block met another, forming an almost invisible seam. He found a small, rusted metal ring, cleverly disguised within the mortar. It was stiff, fused with age and sea salt, but with a surge of adrenaline, he managed to pry it free, revealing a small, almost flush handle. He gripped the handle and pulled. He knew with an undeniable certainty that this was the chamber, the crypt his grandfather had desperately tried to conceal. Dean's fingers traced the faded ink, the parchment cool and brittle beneath his touch. He understood now. This wasn't just a journal. It was a map, a desperate warning. He lifted his gaze from the page, the oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows across the small study. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken things. The journal had spoken of the passage below the keeper's watch, a cryptic clue that now sharpened into focus. Dean knew of no such passage. But then, his grandfather had been a man of secrets, the cottage itself a labyrinth of hidden compartments and forgotten nooks. He wasn't just looking for a hidden room. He was looking for a confrontation, a truth that he already suspected would shatter the fragile remnants of his peace. Dean moved with a new, grim determination, the journal clutched tight in one hand. He started in the small, rarely used cellar beneath the cottage, a space usually reserved for kindling and forgotten tools. He ran his hands along the rough-hewn stone walls, searching for any break in the pattern, any seam that didn't quite belong. After what felt like hours, his fingers brushed against a section of stone that yielded slightly, a faint give that sent a jolt through him. He pressed harder, a groan of ancient mechanisms echoing from within the wall. It was barely large enough for him to squeeze through, a jagged mouth leading into absolute blackness. This was it. This was the threshold. On one side, the world he knew, however fractured. On the other, an unknown, a place his grandfather had desperately tried to seal away. But the hum beneath his skin, the echo of the deep song, compelled him forward. He owed his grandfather that much, and perhaps he owed it to himself to face whatever had haunted his lineage. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Dean squeezed through the opening. The stone scraped against his shoulders, a tight, suffocating embrace. The steps opened into a chamber, not vast, but oddly shaped, its walls undulating as if carved from a living thing. The lamp's light struggled against the pervasive gloom. It wasn't an artifact in the traditional sense, nothing made by human hands. It was a pulsating mass, roughly spherical, yet constantly shifting, its surface a swirling vortex of deep blues, greens, and impossible purples. This was no earthly rock. This was a nexus. It pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a beat that resonated with the deep song in his own body. As he stared, mesmerized and horrified, the air around the sphere began to shimmer. Then the vision came. It wasn't something he saw with his eyes, but something that unfolded directly within his mind, a torrent of images and sensations. He saw the island, not as a solid landmass, but as a fragile, crystalline shell floating precariously over an unimaginable chasm. From the depths, monstrous, unfathomable shapes stirred, their forms too vast, too ancient to fully comprehend. Tendrils, not of water but of solidified despair, reached upwards, coiling around the island's foundations. He saw the lighthouse, its beam feeble and insignificant, then the cottage, and finally, himself. He was standing on the shore, the waves black and oily, receding to reveal not sand, but a viscous, sucking mud. The sky above was not sky, but the underside of a vast, unseen thing, its colossal presence pressing down, squeezing the very air from his lungs. The deep song swelled, becoming a cacophony of silent screams, a chorus of minds consumed and broken. The vision receded, leaving Dean gasping, his knees threatening to buckle. The chamber was still small, the artifact still pulsing, but everything had changed. He had glimpsed the truth, a truth so profound and horrifying that it felt as though his very soul had been stretched thin, transparent. The entity wasn't just beneath the waves, it was within the waves, within the island, and now he knew it was reaching within him. His grandfather's frantic scrawl on the journal page seemed to pulse, each jagged line a testament to a terror that had slowly consumed the old man. Now, Dean understood. The thrumming intensified, a pressure building behind his eyes, a cold tendril reaching from the periphery of his awareness. It wasn't just a sound, it was an attempt, a slow, insistent push against the fragile walls of his mind. He clutched the journal, his knuckles white. The entity wasn't just out there anymore. It was here, actively trying to breach the last barrier. It wanted to enter. It wanted to claim. It pulled at the edges of his sanity, promising oblivion, promising a cessation of the thrumming if he would only let go. His breath hitched. He fought it, clenching his jaw, forcing his gaze back to the journal. This was his only weapon, his grandfather's desperate legacy. His fingers, trembling but resolute, flipped through the brittle pages. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic, dissolving into feverish scribbles and charcoal sketches of impossible geometries, of eyes without pupils staring from inky depths. It was headed with a stark, almost violent drawing of a broken circle, labeled simply, "The Border." Beneath it, the text, though still frantic, was more coherent, infused with a terrible resolve. His grandfather had understood. He had known the entity's true nature, a primordial hunger, a consciousness older than light, seeking to expand, to consume all waking thought, to drag existence itself into its lightless domain. It didn't want the island. It wanted entry. Dean read on, his eyes darting across the page, the thrumming growing louder, vibrating through his teeth. The grandfather had found a way, or at least a theory, a counter-ritual, a sealing. It wasn't a banishment, he realized with a sinking heart, but a fortification, a desperate attempt to shore up the collapsing reality. The note spoke of a specific location on the island, a place where the lines between the dimensions were most porous, where the deep song resonated loudest. The border checkpoint, the old man had scrawled, the final gate, where the barrier thins to nothing. Dean remembered the dilapidated structure, a forgotten stone archway overgrown with tenacious ivy, marking the transition from the winding coastal path to the desolate, fog-shrouded moorland that stretched towards the island's most remote cliffs. It was barely more than a ruin, a relic of some long-forgotten territorial claim, but his grandfather's notes described it as a focal point, a nexus. It was there, the journal stated, that the entity made its most concerted efforts to cross over. And it was there that the sealing had to take place. The method itself was incomplete, fragmented. Dean's gaze fell to the next intact sentence, his heart seizing in his chest. To sever the link, to deny the hunger, a sacrifice must be made. Not of blood, but of self. Not blood, but self. What could that mean? The thrumming in his bones intensified, morphing into a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cottage. Dean felt a terrible clarity settle over him. The entity fed on consciousness, on identity. The journal's next, almost illegible line seemed to answer his unspoken question. The deepest sorrow, the most cherished wound, transformed into an offering of negation. A wave of nausea washed over Dean. His profound personal tragedy, the memories of his lost family, the very grief that had driven him to this isolated island. He would have to rip open his deepest wound, not to heal, but to expose it, to make it a weapon, to sacrifice those precious, painful memories, not to forget them, but to twist them into a barrier, a poison to the entity, rendering his mind, and perhaps the island itself, unpalatable. He gasped, fighting for breath, the journal still clutched in his trembling hands. The terrible sacrifice. He understood. The cost was unbearable, but the alternative was annihilation, and the border checkpoint awaited. The island was no longer simply fog-shrouded, it was dissolving. The mist, once a soft gray shroud, had thickened into an opaque, churning maw, tasting of salt and something metallic, like old blood. Wind shrieked through the skeletal trees, not in gusts, but in a continuous grinding howl that vibrated through Dean's teeth. He clutched the tattered journal, its brittle pages now damp and curling at the edges, a fragile shield against the encroaching chaos. His head throbbed, a dull ache that resonated with the island's deepening agony. The entity was no longer merely stirring, it was actively reaching, its vast, formless consciousness pressing against the very fabric of reality, bending it, twisting it. He could feel it in the air, a cold, hungry presence that whispered promises of oblivion, urging him to simply let go. But Dean wouldn't. Not now. The grief that had been his constant companion, the profound personal tragedy that had driven him to this desolate place, was now his grim weapon. The journal's final cryptic entries, deciphered in the flickering lamplight of his cottage, spoke of a counter-ritual, not of sacrifice in the conventional sense, but of an offering of absence. The entity craved the vibrant energy of living consciousness, yes, but if offered the absolute void of sorrow, the echoes of what was no longer it could be. Satiated, perhaps even repelled. The cost, the journal implied, was profound, a severance from the very capacity for feeling, a living death. Outside, the world was actively rebelling against its own nature. The gulls, usually raucous, flew in erratic, silent loops, their cries choked off. The sparse coastal flora writhed, not in the wind, but as if in agony, their stalks elongating, their leaves developing unnatural serrated edges, gleaming wetly in the gloom. Dean saw it in the lichen on the cottage stones, too, blossoming in grotesque fungal blooms that pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence. The island was becoming a canvas for the entity's grotesque will. He knew he couldn't stay in the cottage. The ritual, as outlined in the journal, required him to go to the deepest point of the island's ancient heart, a place his grandfather had only ever hinted at with a shudder. He had to go now, before the entity's hold became absolute, before his own mind buckled under the ceaseless psychic assault. As he stepped out, the air was like a physical weight pressing against his lungs. The fog had coalesced into swirling gray currents that seemed to have a life of their own, parting and closing around him, revealing glimpses of the distorted landscape. A familiar rock formation, a landmark he'd often used for navigation, now resembled a monstrous calcified hand reaching skyward, its fingers dripping with black, viscous brine. The sight solidified his resolve. There was no turning back, no other path. His path led him along a barely discernible track, a faint memory of a road long reclaimed by the wild. He moved with a determined stride, his boots squelching on ground that was rapidly turning marshy, even on higher elevations. He could hear it now, too. A low, resonant hum beneath the wind's howl, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in his chest cavity. Finally, through a particularly dense curtain of swirling mist, he saw it, the border checkpoint. It wasn't a modern structure, but a ruin, a relic from a forgotten era when some past authority had tried to control access to the island's interior. Two crumbling stone pillars, once perhaps supporting a gate, now stood askew, overgrown with the same sickly, luminous lichen that infested the cottage. Between them, a rusted skeletal framework of what might have been a heavy iron gate hung precariously, swaying with a mournful creak in the unnatural wind. Beyond it, the fog seemed to thicken further, becoming an almost solid wall of gray, tinged with an unsettling deep violet. The hum intensified, a low thrum that now seemed to course through his veins. The immense personal cost wasn't just losing his capacity for joy or love, but for anything. It meant becoming an empty vessel, a living echo of grief, devoid of self, a blank slate where only the memory of loss resided. He would exist, but he would not be. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the full weight of this understanding settle. He had sought solitude, a fresh start. He would find only an ending, a transformation into something less than human. Yet, his grip tightened on the journal. He opened his eyes. The violet-tinged fog swirled before him, beckoning. Wind shrieked through the skeletal trees, not in gusts, but in a continuous grinding howl that vibrated through Dean's very bones. He leaned into it, each step a battle against an invisible current, his oilskin coat heavy and cold against his skin. The air tasted of ozone and something ancient, like primordial silt dredged from an impossible depth. The lighthouse beam, usually a comforting sweep across the turbulent waters, now stuttered, a dying gasp of light swallowed by the encroaching gloom. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. But it was not fear that drove him. It was a cold, sharp resolve, born from the clarity that had finally broken through the layers of grief and confusion. He understood now. His grandfather had not simply been a keeper of light, but a custodian of a barrier, and the island, a lock on a forgotten door. The path to the lighthouse tower was a slick, treacherous incline, illuminated only by the intermittent failing pulse of the beacon above. He slipped once, his hand plunging into the wet, glowing slime that coated the rocks. He didn't flinch. There was no room for hesitation. The entity was no longer merely stirring. It was awake, its presence a suffocating weight on the air, distorting perception, twisting reality at the edges. Here, etched into the stone, almost worn away by time and sea, was a symbol he recognized from his grandfather's journal. A jagged circle bisected by a wavy line, marking a specific threshold. This was it, the border checkpoint. Crossing it felt like stepping not just into a building, but into the entity's very domain, a reality unmoored from human understanding. Inside, the spiraling stairs seemed to stretch into an impossible height, the air thick with the smell of brine and something else. Something decaying and sweet, like forgotten flowers. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant grinding howl of the wind and the rhythmic thump-thump of the lighthouse mechanism, each beat sounding strained like a dying heart. As he ascended, the temperature plummeted, and the slick phosphorescence from outside now coated the inner walls, casting a sickly green glow. He reached the lamp room, a circular chamber where the light source should have been blazing. You are small. You are nothing. The entity probed, searching for weakness, offering solace in oblivion, a release from the pain of existence. Let go. Join the deep. His hands, though numb, found the familiar worn leather of his grandfather's satchel. He pulled out the items. A tarnished silver compass, its needle spinning wildly. A small, gnarled piece of driftwood carved with the same symbol as the border checkpoint. And a vial of his own blood, drawn hours ago with a grim determination. He moved to the circular platform beneath the lamp, where his grandfather's notes had indicated the heart of the pact lay. The floor here was wet, not with water, but with that same viscous, glowing slime. He placed the driftwood in the center, its carved lines seeming to pulse with a faint light. The compass he set beside it, its needle now pointing not north, but straight down, into the very floor. The glass panes of the lantern room groaned under an immense, unseen pressure. Tiny cracks spiderwebbing across their surface. The wind outside roared, no longer just sound, but a living, malevolent shriek that seemed to tear at the fabric of the building. Dean uncorked the vial of blood, his hand trembling, not from fear, but from the immense effort of resisting the entity's psychological assault. He understood the final component of the ritual, the true sacrifice. He poured the blood over the driftwood, watching as it seeped into the carvings, making them glow with a fierce red light. As the blood touched the wood, a guttural roar, not of air, but of pure, ancient sound, erupted from the depths. The lighthouse shuddered violently, the metal structure groaning, twisting. The floor beneath him seemed to buckle, the slime oozing up like black tar. No, you are mine. The sorrow binds you to me. The entity lashed out, not with physical force, but with a tidal wave of grief and despair, pulling at his deepest wounds, threatening to drown him in the very tragedy that had brought him to this island. But Dean pushed back. He closed his eyes, not to block out the horror, but to focus, to remember his purpose. He gripped the driftwood, the blood-soaked wood pulsing warmth into his hand. He was not just sealing a portal. He was accepting a burden, a lonely vigil that would be his penance and his purpose. He would not surrender his memory to this thing. He would protect it. He opened his eyes, a fierce light burning in them. He pressed the driftwood firmly into the glowing slime, pushing it deep into the heart of the platform. It was the sacrifice. Not his life, but his solitude, his freedom, his future. He would be the lighthouse, the beacon, the eternal border. A shriek, not of wind, but of pure, unadulterated agony, tore through the air, reverberating through his skull. The lighthouse shook with a final violent tremor, then settled. The pressure eased. The metallic taste in the air lessened. The glowing slime receded, leaving only damp stone. The crushing weight on his mind lifted, leaving behind a profound, aching emptiness. The lighthouse beam, though still weak, pulsed with a steady, defiant rhythm. Dean stood alone in the lamp room, his hands still throbbing, irrevocably linked to the island. The portal was sealed for now. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the silence was not an end, but merely a pause. He was the keeper now, bound to the light, bound to the deep, forever watching the border. The entity lashed out, not with physical force, but with a tidal wave of grief and despair, pulling at his deepest wounds, threatening to drown him in the very tragedy that had brought him to this island. He saw his loved one, clear as day, smiling, then fading, dissolving into the swirling darkness, their memory twisted into a weapon against him. A cold, abyssal ache seized his chest, a vacuum threatening to collapse his very being. He stumbled, gasping, the air suddenly thick and viscous, tasting of brine and forgotten sorrow. This was the deep song's true power. Not brute force, but the insidious unraveling of the mind, the erosion of all that anchored a soul. He clawed at the stone wall of the lighthouse, its rough texture a desperate anchor against the torrent. No. A single defiant thought, sharp as a shard of ice, cut through the psychic deluge. He wouldn't let it consume him. He wouldn't become another echo in the deep. His grandfather's journals, scattered across the desk, flashed in his mind. The frantic scrawls, the intricate diagrams that he had once dismissed as madness. They weren't just ramblings. They were maps. Maps of containment. Dean pushed back, not with strength, but with focus. He was a cartographer. He understood boundaries, patterns, the imposition of order upon chaos. He forced his mind to resist the emotional onslaught, to instead seek the structure of the attack, the pulse of the entity's malevolence. It was a rhythm, a vibration beneath the waves, echoing through the island's core, amplifying through the very stone of the lighthouse. It was a conduit, a lock, and a key. His grandfather hadn't just kept a light, he had kept it contained. But then, another image superimposed itself. His grandfather, his eyes wide with a desperate knowing resolve, staring out at the churning sea. Dean understood. This was the pact. Not just a historical agreement, but a continuous living burden. He remembered a specific diagram in the journals, an arcane configuration of the lens rotation, the lamp's intensity, and the rhythmic clang of the warning bell. It wasn't about guiding ships. It was about scaring something away, or perhaps holding something down. With a surge of adrenaline, Dean began to enact the ritual. He adjusted the lamp's rheostat, pushing its output beyond safe limits, the glass housing groaning under the strain. He engaged the primary gear, setting the massive lens array into a dizzying, erratic rotation, not a steady sweep, but a jarring, disorienting flicker. And then he manually engaged the foghorn, not in its usual mournful blast, but in a staccato, grating shriek that tore through the night, a sound of pure mechanical defiance. The deep song recoiled. The water beyond the windows thrashed, black waves leaping impossibly high, slamming against the rock face with the force of a battering ram. The entity was enraged, but it was also pushed back. Dean felt the drain, the exhaustion, as if he were wrestling with an unseen leviathan. The struggle lasted for what felt like an eternity, the lighthouse groaning, the glass threatening to shatter, the air thick with the smell of ozone and damp rock. Finally, with a last desperate blast of the foghorn, the thrashing subsided. The waves receded, the black water settling into an unnerving calm. He leaned against the control panel, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the confrontation. He had done it. He had neutralized the immediate threat. But at what cost? His grandfather's madness, he realized, wasn't just a mental affliction. It was the side effect of this constant, vigilant struggle. Days blurred into a haze of exhaustion and vigilance. Dean repaired what he could, maintaining the strange, precise ritual of the lighthouse. The island, the entity, had claimed him. He made the journey to the island's only point of departure, a small, desolate ferry dock that served as a rudimentary border checkpoint for the few who ventured to and from the remote outpost. A lone official, a grizzled man with eyes that had seen too many storms, sat behind a chipped wooden desk, idly stamping a manifest. Dean presented his identification, his hand steady, but his mind a maelstrom of conflicting impulses. He looked out at the mainland, a hazy smudge of green and gray on the horizon, promising normalcy, promising escape. A ferry horn sounded, a distant, hopeful cry. He could walk onto that ferry. He could leave the island, leave the lighthouse, leave the deep song behind. But as he stood there, the faintest tremor rippled through the ground beneath his feet, a subtle vibration that only he could perceive. He felt the fragile balance he had achieved, the temporary peace he had imposed. To leave was to invite its return, to unleash it upon the world beyond the fog-shrouded shores. Dean looked at the ferry, then back at the island, shrouded once more in its familiar heavy mist. The lighthouse, a stark sentinel against the gray sky, called to him. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a terrible, undeniable imperative. He shook his head slowly, a grim, knowing smile touching his lips. "No," he said, his voice raspy, "not quite." He turned from the checkpoint, leaving the official to his manifest, and began the long walk back towards the lighthouse, towards the endless vigil. The deep song waited. And now, so did its new guardian.